Tasha stood under the dim fluorescent lights of her garage, the smell of motor oil and gasoline thick in the air, her hands stained with the marks of her trade. The hum of engines, the rhythmic sound of tools clinking against metal, and the rush of wind through the open bay doors created a melody she knew well, one she'd grown to love over the years. A skilled mechanic, she had built her reputation one engine at a time, taking motorcycles that others had abandoned as lost causes and breathing life back into them. The garage, with its concrete floors and cluttered shelves of parts and tools, had become her sanctuary, a place where she wasn't judged by the color of her skin or the fact that she was a woman in a world dominated by men. Here, it was the work that mattered, and her passion for fixing things drove her through every challenge. Tasha had always loved motorcycles. From a young age, she was captivated by their sleek designs, the roar of the engine, and the freedom they represented. While most girls her age were playing with dolls, Tasha could be found tinkering with the family's old bike, taking it apart and putting it back together, fascinated by how every component worked in harmony to create something powerful. Her father, who had been a mechanic himself, taught her the craft, showing her how to listen to the subtle sounds of an engine, how to understand the language of a machine. It was from him that she inherited not only the skills but the love for the craft, the sense of pride that came from fixing something with your own hands. But growing up as a young black woman in a rough neighborhood, she knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The world outside her garage didn't always see her as capable or competent. In fact, it often overlooked her because of her gender and the color of her skin. She remembered her first day on the job, how the older mechanics at the shop had raised their eyebrows and smirked when she walked in, as though they had already written her off. They didn't believe she could handle the work, assuming that a woman couldn't possibly have the skills to repair a motorcycle. But Tasha didn't let their doubts shake her, she simply proved them wrong, day after day. She worked harder than anyone else, staying late into the night to learn the intricate details of every make and model, figuring out what each machine needed, fixing it until it purred like a new bike. Over the years, she built a reputation not only as a mechanic but as one of the best in the business. She didn't need to fight for recognition anymore, her work spoke for itself. Every time she revved the engine of a bike she'd just repaired, there was a sense of satisfaction that filled her heart, knowing that she had taken something broken, something discarded, and made it whole again. The sound of the engine roaring to life was a victory, a testament to her skill and dedication. But still, the world around her didn't always understand. She could feel the stares of customers when they walked into the garage, their surprise at seeing a woman working on their bike clear in their hesitant questions and raised eyebrows. Some were polite, others openly skeptical, but Tasha didn't flinch. She knew her worth. She knew what she was capable of, and it was never about proving herself to others, it was about proving to herself that she belonged. She didn't need their validation to know she had earned her place in the world of mechanics. Her pride came from the joy she felt when she was in her element, when she had a bike in front of her and the tools in her hands. But it wasn't just the satisfaction of the work that kept her going, it was the community she built around her. Tasha had become a mentor to younger mechanics, both men and women, who came to her for advice and guidance. She taught them not only the mechanics of the machines but also the resilience needed to thrive in a space that often felt unwelcoming. She showed them how to stand firm in the face of prejudice, how to rise above the noise and prove their worth through hard work and passion. She knew that, in a world that often made it hard for people like her to succeed, her journey could serve as a roadmap for others who faced the same barriers. As she wiped the sweat from her brow and adjusted her wrench, Tasha couldn't help but smile. The garage was her kingdom, a place where she had claimed her power, where she had learned to trust in her abilities and her worth. The world might still try to underestimate her, might still whisper about the black woman working in a field that was too rough for her, but it didn't matter anymore. Tasha had proven, not just to the world but to herself, that she was a force to be reckoned with. She had earned her place, one bike at a time, and she would continue to fight, to fix, and to build until her name was known far and wide, not as a woman mechanic, not as a black mechanic, but as one of the finest mechanics there ever was. Maria wiped the sweat from her brow as she crouched down beside the Hell's Angel motorcycle, its dark frame gleaming under the fluorescent lights of the garage. The roar of its engine had once echoed like a thunderclap through the streets of the city, a sound so iconic it seemed to pulse through the air, a declaration of strength and defiance. But now, it sat before her, silent, its massive chrome parts coated with dirt and oil, waiting for her hands to coax it back to life. As a mechanic in a world dominated by men, Maria had earned her reputation, her skill forged through years of hard work, long hours, and an unyielding determination to prove herself. But this bike was different. This wasn't just any machine, it was the Hell's Angel motorcycle, a legend in its own right, one that carried with it a weight far beyond its mechanical power. The moment the bike rolled into the garage, she had felt it, a palpable aura of rebellion, of history, of the untold stories that only a handful of people would ever understand. She could already feel the eyes of the other mechanics on her, silently assessing whether she was capable of handling such a beast. To them, it wasn't just a bike. It was a symbol, a declaration of rebellion, a badge of toughness worn by a brotherhood that was both feared and revered. And for Maria, this wasn't just about fixing a motorcycle. This was about proving, once again, that she belonged in a world where women were too often dismissed, underestimated, and unseen. She slid her hands across the leather seat, feeling the weight of it, the history embedded in every scratch, every nick. The design was bold, uncompromising, much like the riders it had once carried, dangerous, untamed, and yet somehow beautiful in its rawness. She knew the story behind every Hell's Angel bike, the decades of loyalty, the miles of open road, the endless adventures and the broken dreams that were tangled up in the threads of chrome and steel. She had heard the whispers from other mechanics, the rumors of the riders who had brought these bikes in for repairs, the warnings that came with working on them, the dangerous aura they carried, the kind of people who owned them. Yet, none of that fazed her. Maria had always found beauty in the challenge, and this bike was the ultimate test. It was a puzzle, a masterpiece, and she was determined to put it back together perfectly. As she began disassembling the engine, each twist of the wrench felt like an act of respect, a silent conversation between her and the machine. The engine was a work of art, complicated and intricate, with every piece interlocked with the next. She marveled at the craftsmanship, knowing this wasn't the work of a mass manufacturer but something born from passion, from the hands of a creator who had poured everything into making this bike what it was. The grease on her hands didn't bother her, it was just a reminder that she was doing the work she loved, the work that made her feel alive. The clock ticked on, hours passing as she carefully and meticulously worked through the repairs. The garage grew quieter, the world outside fading away as she lost herself in the task at hand. There was a strange peace in it, an understanding between her and the machine, a harmony that transcended words. Every time she hit a particularly tough spot, when a bolt wouldn't turn or a part seemed stuck, she simply paused, took a breath, and reminded herself that this was what she was born to do. She knew that fixing this motorcycle wouldn't just earn her respect, it would solidify her place in a world that had never been kind to women like her. The Hell's Angel bike wasn't just about power or rebellion, it was about endurance, about persistence, about defying odds. And in a way, It mirrored her own journey growing up in a world where she had to fight for every inch of recognition, every moment of success. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't fair, but Maria had learned to push through. As the hours passed, the bike began to take shape again. The engine roared to life, its thunderous sound vibrating through the garage, and Maria's heart swelled with pride. She stood back, wiped her hands on a rag, and admired her work. It wasn't just fixed, it was stronger, more powerful, more alive than before. There was something profoundly emotional about that moment, as if the motorcycle had become more than just metal and machinery. It had become a symbol of everything Maria had worked for, everything she had overcome. The bike represented more than just an opportunity for recognition. It was a test, a trial of skill, but also a test of her own worth. And as she stood there, watching the engine pulse with life, Maria knew she had passed it. She had proven, once again, that she was capable, that she was skilled, and that no one, not even the whispers of doubt from the men who had watched her work, could take that from her. The Hell's Angel motorcycle wasn't just a bike, it was a mirror to her own strength, a reminder that no matter how rough the road was, she could always find a way to keep going. The door to the small mechanic shop swung open with a jarring creak, and the unmistakable rumble of a powerful motorcycle engine followed closely behind. A man entered, his boots heavy against the floor as he walked in with the swagger of someone who had grown accustomed to being feared. Dressed in the signature black leather jacket emblazoned with the Hells Angels logo, his presence seemed to consume the space, filling it with an unspoken challenge. His beard was thick and unruly, his eyes cold, and the scar that ran down his cheek only added to the intimidating aura he exuded. As he approached the counter, his gaze immediately settled on the young mechanic, a woman no older than her mid-twenties, hunched over a workbench with an engine in front of her. She barely noticed his arrival, lost in the rhythm of her work, but the moment their eyes met, the air shifted. The man sized her up with an almost predatory air, the hint of a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips as he took in her youthful face, her hands stained with grease, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. He could hardly hide his skepticism. "You the one fixing bikes around here?" he asked, his voice low, rough like gravel. It wasn't a question of curiosity but one of doubt, as if he couldn't fathom how someone like her could possibly be up to the task. His eyes scanned her with an air of condescension, the thought of a young woman working on a high-powered machine like his bike seeming almost laughable to him. The edges of his words were sharp, coded in the same sneering tone that implied she was out of her depth. The woman didn't flinch. She'd heard it all before. His attitude was nothing new. He was just another in a long line of people who believed her youth and gender were somehow indicative of her abilities, who thought that because she didn't fit their narrow idea of what a mechanic should look like, she must be lacking. She had spent countless hours in this shop, learning the ins and outs of every engine, every gear, every part. She'd put in the work, had the knowledge, and she wasn't about to let this man's dismissive attitude rattle her. His doubts were a constant companion, lingering in the background of every project, from the old-timers who sneered at her presence in the shop to the customers who eyed her with skepticism. It was a familiar story, one she had fought against every single day of her career, proving herself over and over again, until the thought of someone doubting her only made her more determined to show them exactly what she was capable of. The biker crossed his arms, leaning back against the counter, still eyeing her with that same air of superiority. "I need you to take a look at my bike," he said, his voice dripping with a kind of controlled arrogance. "I'm not trusting just anyone with this. You get me?" He motioned to the custom-built motorcycle parked outside the door, its chrome parts gleaming in the sunlight. It was a work of art, a machine he clearly took great pride in. She glanced at the bike for a brief moment, taking in its details, her mind already working through the possibilities of what could be wrong with it. Then, without a word, she wiped her hands on a rag, stood up, and walked toward him. Her movements were deliberate, calm, and sure of herself, unaffected by the biker's challenging posture. "I get you," she replied, her tone steady, her eyes locking with his for the briefest moment. There was no bravado, no need to prove anything, but a quiet confidence that spoke louder than any words ever could. The man raised an eyebrow, taken aback by her composure. He had expected her to stutter or shrink under the weight of his presence, but she did none of that. Instead, she simply turned, walking toward the bike without waiting for any further approval, her hands already reaching for the tools she knew she'd need. He followed her, still unsure whether to be impressed or irritated, but he couldn't deny that something about her confidence unsettled him. He had expected weakness, hesitation, perhaps a show of inexperience, but none of it came. As she knelt down to examine the bike, his eyes lingered on her for a moment longer, and it was then that he saw the ease with which she moved, the certainty in her hands as she examined the engine with an almost intimate understanding. She wasn't fumbling, wasn't second-guessing. In that quiet moment, it hit him this woman knew exactly what she was doing. The revelation was unsettling, a silent crack in the walls of his prejudice. He had walked in with a judgment already formed, convinced that her age, her gender, would dictate her ability to fix his prized bike. But now, he was beginning to wonder if he had made a grave mistake in underestimating her. She didn't speak much as she worked, her focus entirely on the task at hand, but the biker couldn't help but notice the way she moved with purpose, the way she commanded the space around her with a quiet intensity. It wasn't about showing off or proving something, it was simply about doing the job. And for the first time, he began to realize that maybe, just maybe, there was more to her than the stereotypes he had carried with him for so long. His tough exterior softened, just a fraction, as he watched her work, and for the first time, the biker's heart began to question the biases that had guided him for so long. The air in the garage was thick with the scent of oil and metal, a familiar mix that always seemed to ground Lila as she worked. She was kneeling under the hood of a luxury sedan, her hands steady as she carefully adjusted the engine, each move deliberate and precise. The hum of the shop was a quiet soundtrack to her focus, the steady rhythm of tools and machinery almost meditative. But the moment the door to the garage swung open, Lila's senses sharpened, her back straightening instinctively. She didn't need to look up to know who had entered. The sound of expensive heels clicking sharply against the concrete floor made it clear. Rachel, the businesswoman who had always seemed to look at Lila with a mix of skepticism and condescension, was here again. Rachel had the kind of presence that could fill a room, her sharp suit and perfectly coiffed hair an instant reminder of the world that Lila often felt she had to prove herself to. The garage, with its grease-stained floors and worn tools, was a stark contrast to the polished corporate world Rachel inhabited, a world that had no use for a mechanic, much less one who didn't look the part. As Rachel approached, her gaze flicked over Lila with barely concealed disapproval. "I hope you're sure you know what you're doing," Rachel said, her voice smooth but edged with an unspoken question. "This is a pretty high-stakes job. You wouldn't want any mistakes, would you?" The words stung more than they should have, but Lila had grown used to this kind of judgment. She had spent years in this industry, working her way from apprentice to one of the best mechanics in the city, but still, there were those like Rachel who couldn't fathom that someone like her, someone who wasn't dressed in a crisp suit or sporting a perfectly manicured image, could do the work. They saw her not as the skilled professional she was, but as an anomaly, a woman of color in a field dominated by men. A woman who, no matter how talented, would always be questioned, always be doubted. Lila straightened up, wiping her hands on a rag as she met Rachel's gaze, not with defensiveness, but with calm resolve. "I know exactly what I'm doing," she said, her voice steady, though she could feel the weight of Rachel's skepticism pressing down on her. She had heard it all before: the quiet disbelief, the assumptions that a woman, let alone a woman of color, couldn't possibly handle the complex, high-pressure work that came with fixing a luxury vehicle. Rachel arched an eyebrow, clearly not convinced. "Well, it's your reputation on the line," she said, her tone implying that it was not just the job at stake, but Lila's entire credibility in the industry. "I just hope you don't disappoint." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Lila's chest tightened for a moment. She had long since learned to mask the hurt that such comments caused, but the weight of it still lingered, especially when they came from someone like Rachel, someone who embodied the biases of a system that didn't always have room for people like her. Still, Lila didn't flinch. She knew that if she let Rachel's words get to her, it would only prove the very point she had spent her entire career fighting against. She was here to do a job, and she was damn good at it. "I'll get it done," Lila replied, her voice firm, a quiet promise in the words. She could feel the tension between them, the unspoken challenge that now hung in the air. As Rachel stood there, arms crossed, waiting for a mistake, Lila returned her focus to the engine. The quiet click of tools in her hands seemed to cut through the silence, each movement a reaffirmation of her skills, her knowledge, her ability to perform under pressure. She could feel Rachel's gaze on her, the subtle judgment that never quite left. But with every turn of the wrench, Lila's confidence grew, her mind focused on nothing but the job. It wasn't about proving anything to Rachel, it was about proving it to herself, about showing that she didn't need to conform to anyone's idea of what success or competence looked like. The job was finished in half the time Rachel had expected, the engine purring to life with the kind of smoothness that only someone who truly understood the intricacies of machinery could achieve. Rachel stepped forward, her gaze flicking over the work with a mixture of surprise and begrudging respect. There was no overt acknowledgement, no apology for the earlier doubt. But Lila didn't need that. The job was done. It was perfect. And in that moment, Lila realized something important: there would always be people like Rachel, people who doubted her, people who saw her as less than because of her gender or the color of her skin. But what mattered, what would always matter, was the work. The work that spoke for itself. The work that demanded respect, whether it was given freely or not. Rachel didn't say anything more as she turned to leave, her heels clicking sharply against the concrete floor once again. Lila didn't need her approval. She never had. She watched her go, a quiet sense of pride swelling within her chest. It wasn't about proving herself to others anymore. It was about knowing who she was and what she was capable of. And with each day, each challenge, she would continue to show the world what she already knew: there was no job too big, no expectation too high, that she couldn't meet. The dimly lit garage smelled of motor oil and metal, a scent that felt like home to Andrea. Despite the skepticism of the onlookers, she moved with an ease that spoke volumes about her skill. The engine of the Hell's Angel bike was a monster of precision and power, its chrome gleaming under the flickering lights. It had been brought in by a customer who, like many others, assumed that a woman couldn't possibly understand the complexity of such a beast. The murmurs behind her, a mixture of doubt and surprise, only fueled her determination. Andrea had learned long ago to ignore the whispers. She had been wrenching on bikes since she was a child, raised in a garage with a father who believed in teaching her the value of hard work, not coddling her because of her gender. Yet, even after all these years, the looks of disbelief still stung like today, as the burly men leaned against the walls, shaking their heads and muttering under their breath. But Andrea didn't need their approval. She had built her reputation on something far more powerful: competence. The engine lay before her, a puzzle she knew how to solve. Her hands were steady, the practiced movements of a seasoned professional. With a flick of the wrench, she removed the first bolt, her concentration absolute, her mind already calculating the next steps. Each motion was purposeful, reflecting the deep understanding she had developed over years of working with machines. It was an intimate process for her, each turn of the tool and each tightening of the screw a conversation with the bike, as if the machine itself were telling her what it needed. Andrea could feel its pulse, its rhythm, its heart. She heard the hum of the engine in her mind, long before it would roar to life. The men watched in silence now, no longer murmuring, their faces changing from skepticism to awe. Andrea's focus never wavered, she simply worked. As the hours passed, the machine began to take shape, each part falling into place like a perfectly orchestrated symphony. The bike, once a fractured piece of machinery, was slowly transformed by Andrea's hands into something that would soon purr like a well-oiled lion. When the final piece clicked into place, she stepped back, wiping the sweat from her brow, her body aching from the effort, but her heart pounding with satisfaction. She turned the key and the engine roared to life, its powerful sound reverberating through the garage like a promise. The men exchanged surprised glances, their doubts dissolving into reluctant respect. Andrea didn't need to say a word. Her work had spoken for her. She had proven herself once again, not with words, but with her unwavering skill, her professionalism, and her passion for what she did. The Hell's Angel bike sat there, gleaming and powerful, a symbol of everything she had fought for. It was more than just a job to Andrea, it was an art form. She didn't just fix bikes, she breathed life back into them. And as the men slowly started to approach, each of them offering a nod of respect, Andrea knew that, in this moment, she had shattered the assumptions they had placed on her. Their judgment had been based on outdated stereotypes, on the belief that women weren't cut out for this kind of work. But Andrea had proven, with her hands and her expertise, that skill and passion had no gender. It was a hard-earned victory, one that she had claimed with every turn of the wrench, every adjustment, and every moment of doubt she had turned into determination. The mechanic's shop had always been her sanctuary, a place where she could shed the weight of societal expectations and just be. Today, it was her sanctuary once more, but this time, it had also become her battleground. She had won the respect of the men who once doubted her, and in doing so, she had proven to herself that she didn't need anyone's validation. Her work, her professionalism, and her passion for mechanics were all the validation she would ever need. As the men gathered around, eager to see the bike in action, Andrea stood at the center of it all, calm and steady. There was no need for applause, no need for recognition because she already knew the truth. She was a mechanic, and her skills spoke louder than any words ever could. The air in the small garage was thick with unspoken tension, a palpable electricity that hummed through the room as the mechanic worked meticulously on the broken-down motorcycle. His tools clicked against metal with practiced precision, each movement deliberate, but the quiet anticipation from the others in the room made the air feel suffocating. Mark, the businessman, stood at the far side of the room, arms crossed, his face an unreadable mask. His sharp suit, usually so well fitted and immaculate, felt out of place in the gritty surroundings of the garage, but he was too focused on the mechanic's every move to care. His gaze flicked nervously between the mechanic and the bike, his mind running through the possible scenarios. His hands, which were usually in control of deals, negotiations, and business transactions, now rested tensely at his sides. He had always been a man who relied on facts, figures, and tangible results. The situation, with its uncertainty and lack of clear outcomes, made him uncomfortable. Across from him, sitting on an old, worn-out stool, was Vanessa, the biker, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as she watched the mechanic work. Her face, usually so open and fearless, was now a mask of guarded suspicion. The bike she had cherished for years, a symbol of her independence and freedom, was on the line, and she had no idea if this mechanic, a man she'd never met before, could truly fix it. Every second that passed, she could feel her patience fraying, the fear and doubt creeping into her mind. She had been on the road countless times, navigating the harsh realities of life on two wheels, but the unknown here was unbearable. She wasn't just worried about the bike, she was worried about what this moment meant for her. If this man failed, if he couldn't repair the one thing she relied on for her own sense of autonomy, it would be a deeper blow than just a mechanical failure. It would be a betrayal of her own belief in her ability to survive on her own terms. And then there was Lisa, the businesswoman, who had brought them all together in the first place. Her discomfort was the most apparent. Unlike Mark, who was trying to mask his own uncertainties with stoic detachment, Lisa couldn't hide the tension in her posture. Her fingers tapped nervously against her phone, her eyes flicking constantly between the mechanic's work and the others. She had insisted on this mechanic's help, sure that his reputation would deliver the results she needed, but with each passing minute, doubt was creeping in. The more she watched him struggle with the stubborn gears and stubbornly uncooperative engine, the more her own confidence in him seemed to fade. She had always been a woman of control, a businesswoman who prided herself on her ability to make sound decisions. And yet, here she was, with nothing to do but wait and hope that the mechanic could pull off the impossible. She couldn't afford failure, not today, not in front of these two people, especially not Vanessa, who was already too unpredictable, too volatile, in her emotions and her actions. But all the while, her own uncertainty about the mechanic's abilities gnawed at her, slowly eroding the confidence she had once had. Every glance from Mark and Vanessa, every shift in their posture, felt like a silent accusation, a questioning of her judgment. The room was heavy with expectation, as if all their futures were tied to the outcome of this moment. The mechanic, seemingly unaware of the storm swirling around him, continued his work, his brow furrowed in concentration as he adjusted the timing belt with a practiced hand. His focus was absolute, but even he couldn't ignore the growing weight of the eyes upon him. He could feel the pressure of the room's uncertainty, the silent question that hovered in the air, "Can you fix this?" Every twist of the wrench felt like it could either ease the tension or escalate it. He knew the stakes. He had always known that his skill would be tested every time he worked, but this time it was different. There was something raw about the people in this room. Their need for this bike to be fixed went beyond the physical repair. He could sense the silent undercurrent of judgment from Lisa, the nervous anticipation from Mark, and the guarded hope from Vanessa, who was beginning to shift in her seat, her eyes narrowing with skepticism as the minutes stretched on. As the mechanic finished his final adjustments, he wiped his hands on a rag, stepping back to assess his work. The room fell into a silence so thick that it felt suffocating. Mark shifted his weight, tapping his foot impatiently, while Vanessa leaned forward, her body tense, her arms uncrossed for the first time in what felt like forever. Lisa was holding her breath, her eyes fixed on the mechanic's hands, willing him to do something, anything, to prove that his efforts had been worthwhile. The tension in the room was so sharp it felt almost tangible, a pressure that was more than just the uncertainty of whether the bike would start. It was the weight of expectations, of unspoken judgments, of trust that had yet to be earned. And as the mechanic's hands finally turned the ignition, and the bike roared to life with a steady hum, the room exhaled, collectively relieved. Vanessa's shoulders relaxed, the smallest hint of a smile tugging at her lips. Mark nodded, as if this small success had reaffirmed his faith in the mechanic. Lisa's body softened in a silent release of tension, her fingers loosening around her phone. The tension had broken, but the emotional charge remained, lingering in the room long after the engine's sound faded. The workshop was thick with tension, the hum of machines and the sharp tang of oil filling the air as the mechanic, her hands slick with grease, knelt over the sputtering bike. Her brow furrowed in concentration, her eyes narrowing with the weight of both the task at hand and the unspoken judgments that had followed her for years. The room was filled with the subtle rustle of movement behind her, the quiet whispers of the men who had, for far too long, assumed that she didn't belong here, that she was out of place, that her gender disqualified her from truly understanding the intricacies of machinery. They had watched her attempt, then falter, then attempt again, their skepticism lacing every glance they exchanged. But today, it was different. Today, the bike that had stubbornly refused to start for hours, despite every effort she had made, was finally showing signs of life. She could feel it in the air, the pulse of energy that had slowly begun to build as she tightened the last screw and adjusted the final part. She wasn't just fixing a bike, she was proving something. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from the exertion of the work, but from the deep, simmering anger that had fueled her determination. She had spent her life fighting to be seen as competent, to be acknowledged for her skill, to be trusted in a field where men dominated, and her abilities were always questioned. She could still hear their voices, the subtle and not so subtle jabs, the assumptions that her work was only good enough to clean up after the real mechanics, the sneers that accompanied her every success, as if it had been handed to her, as if she had cheated the system. They didn't understand, didn't appreciate the hours she had poured into honing her craft, the late nights spent learning, the sacrifices made to prove herself worthy of even a chance. Yet, as she tightened the final bolt and stepped back, her heart skipped a beat. She didn't need anyone else's approval anymore. This moment, this quiet, powerful moment, was her triumph. She took a deep breath, wiped the sweat from her forehead, and turned the ignition key. The engine sputtered once, then roared to life, the sound filling the space like the breaking of a long silence. It was music to her ears, a sound that resonated deep in her chest, a testament to her skill, her determination, and her unshakable belief that she belonged here as much as anyone else. Her fingers clenched around the wrench, and for a moment, she allowed herself to close her eyes, basking in the satisfaction that only hard-earned success could bring. She had done it. Not because she had something to prove, but because she was damn good at what she did, and no one could take that away from her. The room, which had been filled with skeptical stares just moments before, was now silent, save for the steady thrum of the bike's engine. She could feel their eyes on her, eyes that had once looked at her with disdain, with doubt, but now, there was no mistaking the quiet respect in the air. She wasn't just a mechanic because she was a woman who had fought her way into a male-dominated world. She was a mechanic because she had the knowledge, the talent, and the grit to back it up. Her face reflected a quiet pride as she stood, letting the sound of the engine vibrate through her. It wasn't loud or brash, but in its hum, it carried all the weight of her journey. This wasn't just a victory over the bike, it was a victory over every barrier that had ever been put in her path. It was a declaration that her worth was not tied to anyone else's perception, that her success was not a fluke, but the result of hard work, dedication, and sheer will. For so long, she had been told that she didn't belong here, that her place was somewhere else, somewhere softer, less demanding. But she had fought those assumptions every step of the way, every time someone had doubted her, every time someone had questioned her ability. And now, standing here in front of the very people who had once dismissed her, she knew that nothing could take this moment from her. The bike's engine roared louder, almost defiantly, as if celebrating the victory with her. She gave it one final twist of the throttle, letting the sound echo through the shop, and a smile tugged at the corners of her lips. This was her moment. This was the moment when she no longer had to explain herself, when her work spoke for her in ways words never could. The bike was fixed, but more importantly, so was she, not just in the eyes of her critics, but in her own eyes, the eyes that had spent years questioning if she was enough. As the mechanic stood there, a sense of quiet satisfaction washed over her. This moment of triumph, small but significant, was hers. She had done it, not because of anyone's approval, but because she had never stopped believing in herself, in her skill, in her worth. And as the bike's engine settled into a steady purr, she knew one thing for certain: she had earned every ounce of this success, and she would not let anyone ever make her doubt that again. Jake had always prided himself on knowing everything there was to know about bikes: how they hummed, how they roared, and how to fix even the most complex of issues. His worn leather jacket, the tattoos that ran down his arms, and the greased-up fingers all told the story of a man who had lived a life of rebellion, fast rides, and heavy-duty mechanics. So, when his prized Harley broke down in the middle of nowhere, he wasn't expecting to find a mechanic who could possibly live up to the reputation of his own know-how. He pulled into a small, weathered garage on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where grease stains and old tools were more familiar than polished floors or showroom displays. The last thing he expected was a woman, small, unassuming, and, to be blunt, out of place. Her name was Maya, and she greeted him with the quiet confidence of someone who had done this for years, but Jake couldn't shake the initial skepticism that lingered. What could she know about fixing the beast of a machine that was his Harley? He'd seen plenty of so-called mechanics over the years, but none who truly understood the heart of a bike the way he did. As Maya examined the bike, Jake hovered, watching with a mixture of doubt and curiosity. He could see the way she worked: methodical, focused, and with an ease that suggested experience. But even as she worked, his mind couldn't quite shake the disbelief. A woman, in a place like this, under the hood of a bike that only men seemed to understand. He couldn't help but wonder if she had the chops. As Maya worked, Jake found himself muttering under his breath, doubting her ability to get the bike up and running. He had grown up in a world where mechanics were men with rough hands and calloused fingers, the kind who'd lived their lives under the hum of engines. And yet, there she was, bending over the Harley with a wrench in her hand, the grease smudging her forehead as she focused intently on the task at hand. She didn't flinch at his skepticism. Her eyes didn't meet his as she worked, but there was an unspoken confidence in her posture, a sense of purpose that made him pause. As the hours passed, Maya worked with an intensity that slowly wore down his doubts. The sound of the wrench against the engine no longer seemed foreign in her hands, and when she spoke to him, her voice was calm and assured. "The timing's off," she said, her brow furrowing as she adjusted a piece of the motor. "You need to replace this coil. It'll fix the stalling problem." Jake watched her as she moved around the bike, a strange sense of respect beginning to settle in his chest. It wasn't just that she was good, it was that she was better than good. She was precise, professional, and unwavering in her skill. She didn't need his validation, didn't need to prove herself with bravado or theatrics. She simply knew what she was doing. When the bike finally roared to life, its engine purring like it had never been out of commission, Jake's heart skipped. He couldn't believe it. His bike, the one he'd spent months customizing, was running smoother than ever before. He stood there for a moment, his mind racing to reconcile what he had just witnessed. The mechanic, this woman had done what he thought was impossible. He had doubted her ability from the start, had questioned whether a woman could really understand the mechanics of a motorcycle the way a man could, but in this moment, those doubts vanished. It wasn't just the bike that had been fixed, it was his perception of what competence looked like. Jake's mouth went dry as he approached her, still trying to wrap his mind around what had just happened. I gotta admit, I didn't think you could pull it off, he said, his voice rough. Maya stood up from under the bike, wiping her hands on a rag, and looked him square in the eye. There was no smugness in her gaze, no sense of "I told you so." Just quiet pride, the kind that came from knowing she had proven herself not for him, but for herself. "It's all in the details," she replied simply, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Jake hesitated for a moment before speaking again, his voice softer now, less guarded. "You've got skills," he admitted, the words tasting unfamiliar on his tongue. "I didn't expect that. Honestly, I thought, well, you know. I thought a woman couldn't." He stopped himself, realizing how ridiculous it sounded. Maya didn't flinch, but her expression softened. "It's easy to make assumptions," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "But competence doesn't have a gender." That one sentence hit him harder than the sound of a revving engine. For the first time in his life, Jake understood the depth of his own biases, the ones he had held without even realizing it. His world had been built on assumptions, the belief that certain roles were meant for certain people. But watching Maya work, seeing her skill and dedication, he realized how much he had missed. There was no gender in competence, no stereotype in expertise. There was only the work, and Maya had shown him what true skill looked like, regardless of who held the tools. In that moment, something inside Jake shifted. His respect for Maya wasn't just about her ability to fix his bike, it was about his newfound understanding that real skill, true professionalism, and the strength to defy expectations weren't bound by the limits he had once believed. His grudging respect blossomed into something far deeper, a quiet gratitude and admiration for the woman who had shattered his preconceived notions and, in doing so, had changed his perspective on life itself. Standing alone in the garage, a quiet sense of triumph settled over Lena as the hum of the engines around her seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the pulse of her own heartbeat. The grueling hours of wrenching, of proving herself in a world that had constantly tried to keep her in the shadows, had led to this moment, a moment that marked not just the completion of an important repair, but the quiet acknowledgement of her worth. Her hands, still stained with oil, trembled slightly as she wiped them on a rag, the weight of the moment finally sinking in. Just hours before, she had been met with resistance and skepticism, her skills questioned by those who assumed that her gender and appearance automatically disqualified her from belonging in this space. But when the bike sputtered to life under her expert hands, when the rumble of the engine signaled the success of her work, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The biker, who had once scoffed at her presence, now stood before her with a look of genuine respect. His eyes, usually clouded with disdain, were clear, and for the first time, he acknowledged her as a peer. "You've got talent," he said, his voice no longer tinged with the arrogance that had marked his earlier remarks. Lena nodded, her chest swelling with a quiet sense of victory. It wasn't the words, but the tone, the shift in how he saw her, that felt like a true win. It was a long road, one full of subtle slights and outright dismissals, but in that moment, Lena knew she had finally carved out a space for herself in a world that had been unwilling to make room for her. The businesswoman who had doubted her the most, who had subtly undermined her at every turn, now stood off to the side, her arms crossed in reluctant acknowledgement. She hadn't expected Lena to succeed, she had expected failure, or at the very least, a struggle that would ultimately prove Lena's place was outside the shop, outside the circle of those who belonged. But now, there was no denying it, Lena had done what they said couldn't be done. She had not only repaired the engine but had also shattered the unspoken rules that governed this male-dominated world. The businesswoman's grudging nod, the way she stood there silently watching Lena, spoke volumes. It wasn't a full endorsement, not yet, but it was a start. And in this world, where respect was often earned through defiance and skill, Lena had taken the first step toward claiming it for herself. The other mechanics, who had once dismissed her, now looked at her with a new understanding. They no longer saw her as an outsider, a woman trying to fit into a space that wasn't made for her. Instead, they saw her as someone who belonged not because she was trying to prove herself, but because her skills spoke for themselves. The engine purred to life, and the once skeptical crew exchanged glances, some nodding, others simply shaking their heads in reluctant admiration. Lena could feel their gaze, not the mocking stares from before, but something different, a silent acknowledgement that she had earned her place here. It was a subtle shift, but it was everything to Lena. She had been breaking barriers her entire life, navigating spaces that were designed to keep people like her out, but now, here, in this garage that had once felt so foreign, she had made her mark. As she walked toward the exit, the garage door rising behind her, Lena allowed herself a small smile. She had proven not just to them, but to herself, that competence and skill were not defined by gender, race, or any other barrier society sought to erect. She had done the work, and the work had spoken for itself. The journey was far from over, she knew the road ahead would be filled with more challenges, more moments where she would have to fight to be seen and heard. But in that moment, Lena knew she had already taken the most important step forward. She had earned respect. She had earned her place. And she would keep fighting, not just for herself, but for all the women and people of color who had been told their dreams were too big for the world they inhabited. Lena wasn't just fixing bikes anymore, she was fixing the system, one engine at a time, showing that there was nothing she couldn't do, no place she didn't belong. The world was shifting, slowly, but it was shifting, and Lena was at the forefront of that change. The mechanic had not only found her confidence, but she had opened the door for others who would follow, proving that no matter the barriers, talent would always find a way to shine. And as she left the garage that day, her head held high, Lena knew the future was hers to shape, and she wouldn't stop until the world saw what she was capable of.